All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are calling in from the world. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Many of you have probably already been on a webinar with CT Strategies, so welcome back to those that are new or coming from the Tradeworthy fan club. Welcome to you, and for anyone else who's new, welcome. We Before I begin, I just want to just kind of level set what we plan on talking about today. I'm sure you all signed up based on seeing the title of how to cope with what we're seeing in the world of tariffs these days. Just a little bit of context and a story how we got there. So this webinar comes to you, as you could see from the announcement from both CT Strategies and Tradeworthy. So Danny, I'll give you credit. Danny Burrows, I'd like to give you the credit for coming up with this idea, and then we started assembling this. And like any good starting idea, it starts in the basement of one's mind and then becomes a reality. So this is the beginning of that. So the partnership between CT Strategies and Tradeworthy really brings a couple of different things together. From our perspective, is CT Strategies has really developed as a customs and trade consultancy, whereas when we started working with Danny, it was like the inverse of everything that we didn't have, he had, and vice versa. So Tradeworthy coming from really the trade policy side and what we see globally. So it's an interesting fit, and it really does serve to set the context for why we decided to have this conversation. The the world is obviously changing. I don't want to be trite. I don't want to say anything that I'm sure everybody has seen, 100 times over or thought to themselves as they watch the news or read something about the latest. We'll be talking today about just the latest trade announcement, whatever we want to call it, was announced in the past 24 hours. But what we're constantly looking at, and I think this is true of both our companies and the clients that we serve, is the need for predictability, right? I remember myself when I was in U.S. Customs, the complaints or the concerns from the private sector, Michael, I'm looking at you on this one, were always centered around really two things, and there were discussions about um, speed with which commerce is moving and making sure things really, kept with the pace of business. But I think at the heart of everything, really were transparency and predictability. And I think when we look at the world as we're looking at it now, one thing we want to try to provide as consultants, as assistants in this space is how do we help our clients really get that level of predictability and as much transparency and really awareness as possible. So we started thinking about, there's obviously just the major global event of our time in terms of trade and the supply chain is what's going on with tariffs. But it really serves as a starting point for a lot more. And when we look at how the landscape is really shaping up, we had a number, and to be honest with the group on this call, we had a lot of concerns and discussions about how are we going to come out and really serve best the people that we communicate to, both in our business relationships and through things like our webinars and our thought pieces, in a way that's going to be effective and helpful. And we kind of leaned back and really thought, well, one of the things that we really do at CT and Tradeworthy is we bring together a lot of disciplines, and we put teams together that really serve the same challenge, but from different interests, from different angles. And so that's what we've done here today. It's a real pleasure to be joined by this group. I would never do any of these individuals enough credit and a service to introduce them. So I'm going to let them do that themselves in a minute, and as well as give you some of the context of what they're seeing. But really, what we've done is bring people from who are former customs, both from the U.S. And around the world, former trade negotiators, former foreign officials, current and former private sector practitioners that live and breathe in the supply chain, in the trade agreements how different decisions by different governments really do affect what we're seeing, and hopefully show you an outline and potentially a starting point for getting your business a level of awareness of the exposure that they have, both through their tariff and through other new postures that we're seeing. For example, we were talking about this just the other day, that in addition to the tariffs, we are seeing a heightened enforcement posture, for example, from U.S. Customs. And so that doesn't only mean, a different tariff regime that may or may not come into play at certain points in time, but it also means what to do in terms of managing your relationships with customs, with the individuals at the border, and not just customs, right? I mean, everybody on this call will know that, there's a number of different agencies that have equities at the border. For example, in the US, there's 47 of them. So how do we really put that piece together in a way that allows you to have awareness of your supply chain from down to the SKU level of tariff exposure to the strategy that you employ both in your supply chain and your entry points in order to manage the supply chain as effectively as possible. So we're going to walk through that today. We are going to start off by going around the group here, letting them introduce themselves to you, as well as give you a little context of what they're seeing from their perspective. And then we're going to get into kind of making it a little bit more practical by looking at we came up with a case study. This is going to be unique to the case study, as is all of your supply chains that we're thinking about, but it should highlight a manner in which we can approach the challenge and a way to start laying out potential solutions, both in the near term, the midterm, and the long term. Just about a little bit of administration. We are recording this. We'll get this out to the group that joined to make sure everybody can watch it over and over. I'm sure you'll binge watch this for your entertainment as you go on through the rest of the week. But also, we'll make sure you have our contact information, a way to reach out to us should you have any follow-up questions that are particularly unique to your challenge. In that vein, on questions, we do have a Q&A. Please use that. We will not, don't feel like you need to save your questions till the end. We'll be happy to intertwine them into the discussions that we have. I'll be monitoring them. And again, just to come back to the point, if there's a specific to your company question, and we really need to spend a little bit more time on it, we'd be happy to have that conversation, after the webinar at a convenient time. So without further ado, I want to get right into it. We have an hour, which is hardly seems enough time, but probably is enough to keep my short attention span. So we'll start off by doing a bit of a round of introductions. And Tim Ward, we're lucky to be here with you, and maybe you can just give a little bit about your background, and then if you wouldn't mind just going into what you're seeing in terms of the world that you work in, and a little bit of context of maybe what we're going to see in the future.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm in London at the moment, outside of London at the moment, so it's well and truly into the afternoon where I am, but it's a pleasure to be with so many of you this afternoon to talk about this issue. As you may be able to pick up from the accent, I'm neither American nor British for that matter. I come from a background of working for the Australian Public Service in their areas of foreign affairs and trade, and in particular spending most of my career on negotiating elements of trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, and in particular focusing on issues to do with the rules of origin. And that sort of brought me into this area. The recent times that since the change in administration has led to something of what I think is probably a bit of a mind shift in the way that people approach, the way they focus on issues to do with trade. Whereas in the past, a lot of what we were doing was making sure that we got the tariff code correct and finding the appropriate tariff rate for that under the proposed architecture that was announced at the beginning of April. Our mindset needs to change. So because when it comes to to leveling tariffs on imports into the US, the focus is entirely on the country of manufacture rather than the country of export. And so we need to build up a clear understanding of just where the good has been manufactured as far as CBP, the customs regulations are concerned. And so this, as I say, is a bit of a shift in mindset. These are the sorts of things that we've been looking at for some time. They are governed by what are referred to as the rules of origin, and any people that have worked with free trade agreements like USMCA or others would be well aware of these. For non-preferential general trade, rather than being a hard and fast set of rules, it's more the rules of origin are governed sort of as a set of broad principles that are talking about the good needs that the country of origin is where the last manufacturing process, which substantially transformed the materials, took place. And so that's something that we need to be aware of. And what that leads into for us, and what is concerning a number of people that I speak to in my role these days, is to have a clear understanding of what their supply chain really looks like. So rather than just focusing on where the goods are coming from in the first instance, we need to be able to be satisfied and be able to satisfy customs that we are stating the correct country of origin that meets with customs interpretation of those broad principles. So what that's going to mean for us going forward as traders is that we build up a very strong relationship with our suppliers so that we get a much better understanding of just what that supply chain looks like, so that when it comes round to signing off on a declaration of origin as part of your import documentation, you can say with a degree of certainty that the goods originate in a particular country, which will then determine what level of tariff that you're likely to have to pay on that good. So those are the sorts of issues that are focusing my attention at this stage. And they're the sorts of issues that I'm sure that many of the participants here today are also somewhat concerned about going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tim, and I think you raise a number of good points. But I think one of the things is we're going to transition over to Brad in a second. This concept of awareness and really knowing your suppliers, that's something. And Brad, I'll turn it over to you in a second, without spoiling your resume that you're going to go through. I'm sure a lot of people who have called in know that you were former director of the CTPAT program, the AEO program in the U.S. And when you start talking about having a good relationship with suppliers, having a good understanding of your supply chain, just really digging deeper, I think it becomes evidence of why we are on this call, us that, have our CTPAT Navigator work that we do. But it really starts to bring a lot of different things together. The other thing before I give it the horn over to you that I think Tim raised that I think really needs to be underscored almost at every turn is this is one of the key ways that you can, really try to find predictability in a really uncertain landscape. And Tim, to your point, just really digging in and really having just a lockdown understanding of your own supply chain and your own kind of your own exposure is really going to be critical because I think as we look at potentially offering help, I think the most important starting point is that, right? Because we are going to see a number of announcements and potential changes, although we'll talk about that in a little bit of where we think this is going to shake out. But no matter what the future holds, that valuable awareness that we have, really does start to serve as the base for any potential solution that we're going to employ. So I appreciate Tim that and appreciate you being here. So I teed you up a little bit. I'm a terrible hype man, Brad, but I'll let you do that for yourself and go ahead and take it away.
Certainly. And thank you, Andrew. Colleagues, good day from Houston, Texas. My name is Brad Skinner. I'm an affiliate with CT Strategies. I've been working with CT for the last 3 years, primarily doing security-based reviews for companies. My career path, I've done a variety of trade, law enforcement roles within Customs and Border Protection. I was with the agency for 34 years. I started my career as an import specialist. And so some of the things that are being spoken to today, such as classification, valuation, qualification under free trade agreement, substantial transformation, as Tim mentioned, ensuring the admissibility of goods coming into the country. And I think just, generally ensuring that goods were compliant coming into the country. I've also, as Andrew mentioned, was the director of the TPAT program for 5 years. Great honor, great privilege for me. A couple of foreign assignments, both in Mexico and Canada along the way, and a lot of work along the US-Mexico border. Andrew, you mentioned heightened trade enforcement posture by CBP. I can certainly validate that. It's not new for Customs and Border Protection. Been doing this for 240 years, more or less, right? But I think that pendulum is certainly swinging to that trade enforcement posture to make sure goods coming into the country are in fact admissible. As to your question, as to what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, and I think this is a thing everybody can, certainly relate to. It's just companies are saying, where do I begin? How do I stay on top of this ever-changing landscape? It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to analyze, to gather information, gather it, and then to make informed decisions. Most of my work has been focused on the US-Mexico supply chain. I think there's probably, two themes that come up. One is security, safeguarding, preserving, or perhaps even considering in being a member of the TPAT program, and that do my goods qualify under the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement as originating goods? There are 2 points that I just wanted to get out of my opening comments here. Initially, I'll refer to them as strategies, but things that, I take away from some of my conversations and work on the ground. Number one, I think companies are really focused on enhancing their internal and external partnerships. I was with a large industrial manufacturer in Mexico not too long ago, who had stood up a committee, a nerve center, if you will, with representatives from the security department, logistics and shipping, procurement, finance, to look at and consider any changes for supplier pathways. What's the impact from a security perspective and from the tariff perspective? Because the two really do work hand in hand. And I think that's important, having internally, call it what you will, a war room, nerve center, committee, but bringing those offices together, and then working with external partners, right? Whether it be government agencies, transportation providers, knowledgeable experts, customs brokers, those who do this day in and day out for a living. And then the other common thread, and I think this goes through the entire, global structure with new regulatory requirements, forced labor, tariffs. It's knowing your customer, knowing your supply chain. And Tim, you did a wonderful job, focusing in on that. I know you picked up on that as well. A basic question is just who's in your supply chain? What are they doing with your goods, your information, and how are you documenting this? How do you know it? How are you assessing risk for your company? Now it's not just enough to go back one layer in the supply chain or even two, right? You may have to go back to where the cotton was sourced to spin the yarn and woven into fabric, or where the critical minerals were mined, or where was my aluminum or steel smelted that I used in the manufacture of my finished good refrigeration units, for example. So knowing your supply chain, those who are in it, I think are And it gets difficult to do that, have that layer of granularity, that layer of detail. And then I guess my final thought, things that come to mind for, keys to success, having a solid executable plan that's adaptable, being able to pivot as things change, as we know from day to day. Dedication to both security and compliance excellence, right, within the organization. I think if companies focus on that, that's huge. Using your own data, mining that data to make informed decisions, whether it comes from your customs trade databases, from your suppliers, and then again, just partnering with all the right people in your supply chain to make it work, to keep goods flowing efficiently and effectively. So Andrew, I'll stop there. I know I think Michael follows me, but I'll let you comment or turn it over to the next guest.
No, I appreciate the words, Brad, and I just want to pick up on a couple things you said. Without I don't think we really rehearsed this, but when I do say knowing your customer, as Tim started off, and I said it was going to be underscored, you picked up on that and kept going. I also think it raises a challenge, and I think, we are here to try to put our arms around this challenge because we see it, we've seen it for years and quite frankly now decades in the AEO program where that level of insight into your supply chain, the question always that we get, and including now is, well, how much is enough, right? How much do I have to do? And we can spend, and we have spent a ton of webinars, right? Just on that, on really identifying, risks and how to have that relationship. And I always think of, I remember when I was in high school, I'll date myself because there was a woodshop class that I don't think exists anymore, but I had a woodshop teacher as I'd be building something and I'd ask, how big does this have to be? What's the measurement here? And he would always tell me, well, how long is a piece of string? Because, the point was you figure it out, right? Like there's no answer. And I think a lot of times when our customers are coming to us from the perspective historically through our work in the CTPAT program, that question, how much is enough? How much do we have to do? Now, the requirements of the trade landscape, not just in the AEO program, are requiring a certain level of insight. The other thing I really want to pick up on what you said, which I think is important, and it dovetails into two things, is that notion of if you are going to come up with alternative plans, how does that not only affect the tariff exposure that you have, but now you might be exposing yourself to other security challenges that you have, whether it's diving into other strategic trade priorities that customs around the world are having from, the forced labor issue you mentioned. E-commerce continues to be a problem. What's going on with de minimis continues to be a challenge. So while you may be walking away to try to solve one issue, you may be walking into a challenge from another issue. So I think that's a phenomenal point and something that we have seen. So to turn that point to, the how long is a piece of string and how much is enough, the unenviable position to potentially try to discuss that is Michael Ford. And Michael, I kind of previewed you when I said I was looking at you on the private sector. I worked in and around the leadership of CBP enough to remember when you were on the COAC and we're not shy about your opinions in any way, shape, or form. So anyway, anyone who's on this call knows that I think Michael was a very vocal but also very valuable voice in how CBP particularly was shaping its policies and continues to be to this day. And it's a real pleasure to have you on the webinar and have you as a friend and a colleague and as we look at these interesting times. So I'll turn it over to you. You can go ahead and give your
Yep.
background and then what you're seeing.
Yep. Thank you, Andrew. So good day to everyone. Michael Ford. I'm with TradeBridge Consulting. I'm on my own consulting now. my background is very operational. I work for an international freight forwarder. And so that is dealing with, as we all know, in that day-to-day grind, right? Dealing with the minutia, the details and everything along that lines. And when I worked in that world, I worked with many different companies, with many different industries. So I believe I have a great background on the operational side, the day-to-day deals. But Andrew, I think you brought up a really good point. Like, what am I seeing day to day? And I'll just share with everyone, previously, before all this tariff, if an issue came up, you would get on the phone and you would talk with a compliance person and you would talk it out and kind of solve it. Now, what's happened is, I'll be contacted and say, Mike, do you have a few minutes? We want to talk about an issue. And then we will have multiple people with various departments. And I think that speaks to what Tim mentioned earlier. You're going to be exposed to the business units, and within that business unit is multiple people. And what that really tells us, right, is how important all these changes are to the different business units. And so it's no longer just a one-on-one and trying to solve the issue. It's much bigger, which then forces, and I think, Brad mentioned this is, the compliance, it's not, these issues are not just a single person who's got to solve it, right? It takes a team. And so companies really need to make sure they have their proper team set up from the various departments to try and work on these issues. Because I think, one of the things I've experienced and, and kind of go back to Tim Greta put a great story out and it talked about manufacturing. And I will tell you what I've seen is, of course, US companies looking at their manufacturing processes in the US, but also outside the US and really looking at that. And so what that involves is the business units and they're talking about their issues and it's really, how can I reduce my cost or what other options are out there? Brad talked about USMCA, free trade agreements, there's various options. And I think Danny may go through some of that a little bit later. Sorry, Danny. But so what I'm seeing is definitely, the manufacturing issues that are out there, not only in the US, but outside the US and companies outside the US who are trying to maybe still work and bring products into the US are truly being challenged in that area. So it's a lot of fun. So Andrew, I think we got Gordon coming up, so I'll let Gordon go through. Thanks.
Yeah, it's almost like we planned it for you to bring up the outside the US and then turn to our one of our other outside the US resident experts. But yeah, I mean, I think as we look at these solution bases, as we pivot to you, Gordon, I think a lot of what sparked the idea for the webinar is what's happening to goods coming into the US. But that's probably the start of this long story and what might be happening in the future in terms of new agreements or reciprocal actions and what we'll be seeing. So with that, Gordon, I'll turn it over to you and let you do your own hype as you do so well.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, as you can hear, I'm not an American. I've got dual nationality, British and Irish. Yes, it is compatible. It is possible. My background is with the UK Customs Administration and the European Commission. Quite similar to Brad, I started really on the frontline type work and sort of worked my way up during the course of my career. Ended up at the European Commission in the latter part of my career and was responsible for the technical negotiations for the EU AEO program and TradePath, which brought me into contact with Andrew Brad and Sean Beddoes, who's also on this call. That really developed a deep understanding of EU-US transatlantic trade because I was there in the States on a regular basis. I was visiting companies. I could see the challenges they had and the point made on supply chains. As all of you who are involved in AEO or TradePath programs will know, knowing your supply chain thoroughly is a key component. And that's transferable into what we're seeing today with the advent of the tariffs and the new requirements that will be coming through. So my role within CT Strategies, I am the Executive Director for European Operations here. In addition to that, I provide some advisory services to the Global Air Cargo Association, TIARCA, and the IMF on customs trade and security matters. Focusing on the impact and how it's being felt here in the EU, I'm based in Brussels, so I feel it firsthand. but also in the UK, one of my home countries. I think the first thing to really take into consideration was there's a high degree of surprise here, actually, to be honest with you. And that's based on the fact that the European Union and the United States, the world's largest bilateral trade, have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship, and the in terms of goods and finances and so on. And when you look at the balance of payments, they're more or less equal when you take those into consideration. Both are shipping critical goods to each other, and I thought it might be important to mention some of them. From the EU to the US, they include things like medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, advanced machinery and equipment, and aerospace parts. And in return, from the United States, we get a great deal of natural gas and oil, which contributes to our energy security. And that really, and that long-standing relationship, together with the sharing of those critical components, it really contributed it to being a big impact and a big surprise here. And really, the UK and the EU took kind of divergent approaches to it. The UK looked straight away to try and get a deal as soon as possible, and I'll touch on that in a moment with the yesterday's announcement. But the EU Commission reacted a lot more cautiously and to a bit of a degree, a bit more aggressively in starting to discuss countermeasures, particularly around steel and aluminium, or aluminum, as you call it in the States. I always like to make that point. Those discussions and those tariffs, as you know, have been paused in Europe, like they have in the EU, as they have done in many other jurisdictions, up until the 14th of July. But what I can say from the European perspective is the Commission and the member states are not sitting on their hands. They're actually getting prepared if those talks fail, and countermeasures, so reciprocal measures. And they've actually launched a public consultation with their traders to find out from them what should be in scope and out of scope in terms of products. From the EU perspective, from the UK perspective, you would have heard the announcement from yesterday. It's an ever-shifting television news channel at the moment of new things coming through. And the UK now has done a partial deal on tariffs, where there are no tariffs on aerospace parts, and a reduction on all other goods from 25 now to 10% in terms of tariffs. What's still outstanding is a deal on steel, but there's consensus that should be possible to get that down to a 0% tariff. Just to conclude, Andrew, just how it's being perceived by the traders, by the companies here. Most of them that are trading into the US have had a long-standing relationship with the US, going back over tens of years, taking into consideration what I've mentioned. So they're very jittery, basically. And what they want to know is they want to know about predictability. They want to know what steps they need to take within their supply chains. So they've got real visibility to understand what the impact is. They are looking at other things like, do we need to pivot into new markets and so on? That's true and that's natural. And they're also looking at supply chains and whether they need to make any changes to their supply chains, or basing their manufacturing companies in other countries and so on. So that's the general overview, Andrew.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Gordon. Just tying something that Brad mentioned to what you're talking about, and for those on the call that are, kind of interested in a deeper dive in what's happening from that side of the world back into the US, we can have a longer conversation. But this concept of, it's not just the tariffs that are affecting the uncertainty and the actions, in Europe, as we were talking about last week when I was with you. You've got the customs reform in the EU. You've got things that are happening over the next 2 years that are going to create, confusion and uncertainty at an operational level, while there's some of this confusion and uncertainty at the tariff and policy level. So how those things come together is something that, I know the collective group here and the larger team of experts that we have access to are going to keep our kind of finger on the pulse. I think that is an important thing that we're going to do is between Tradeworthy and CT Strategies, because it gets complicated pretty quickly. I mean, everybody who's listening to this and anyone who's worked in customs or the supply chain, it knows it ain't easy on the best of days. And this is a complicated practice. This is a complicated business.
Right.
And I think our job now is to, as we'll just continually to beat this drum, is to try to establish the amount of transparency, awareness, and predictability that we can, so that when the uncertainty comes, there are decision points that are as clear as possible, so that we can move on. So I appreciate that view from the other side. Well, without not to be last here, Danny, hopefully I gave you enough shout outs at the beginning. I don't want to undermine the fact that you are the brainchild of this idea that then sparked into kind of the labor of love effort that all of us have gotten into. So I'll turn it over to you, let you give your background as well as what you're seeing, and then we'll pivot to the case study that I mentioned at the beginning.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to be with everyone. I'm afraid you have to put up with another Australian accent on the call. So it's Danny Burrows here, the CEO of TradeWorthy, based in sunny San Francisco. Also a former Australian federal government trade negotiator and legal counsel, mainly negotiating trade agreements with partners in the Asia Pacific region. We work with companies on trade and foreign investment projects, and also with governments on the policies that they apply to their traders and investors. So first things first, Andrew, really excited to partner with CT Strategies on TradePath, which will be kind of soft launching today and discussing and going through the way that bringing together a range of multidisciplinary experts focused on one supply chain can really, hopefully, start to mitigate some of that tariff and duty exposure. But also, as we've talked about, the other measures around adaptability and predictability in a very, very fast-changing landscape. Very high level, what we're seeing is, I'm focused, of course, on trade agreements, and these agreements that are meant to come within a very short amount of time. On average, trade agreements between two countries take around 3 years to negotiate. But the administration, as we know, is trying to finalize agreements with 150 countries in less than 3 months. We're already well down that path, I think under a month to go. So here's what we're seeing, and I don't want to cover the ground that Gordon mentioned, but with the UK, what is really clear, that was one of the forerunners, I think, in fact, the first agreement to be announced, is that 10% is going nowhere. It seems across the board, with kind of tariff peaks up to around 25% with those that they can agree a deal with. But what we're not seeing is the detail that really matters, and that is not the headline rate, but the rules, particularly things like rules of origin, the SPS, or these sort of hygiene factors around when you bring food and medicinal products between countries. And all of these things really make a trade agreement either stand up over time or fail. With China, of course, it's ultimately a political issue. I would even say that agreements that are announced within this period, this reciprocal tariff period, can't be relied upon long term. It is going to change, truth post, social by post. And so even agreements that are announced may continue to have that chop and churn. What we are seeing with China is that there's a push for reduction of Chinese content or value add, whether that's added in China or added in a country outside of China. That is a dynamic we're clearly seeing at play. India actually have announced a kind of moving towards a deal. They're kind of pushing back on this idea of a short-term concept of just agreeing headline tariff rates. They're saying we want the text of a trade agreement finalized before we go public. Who knows whether that will happen, but it's looking like that 10% base will be there for most of their exports, in return for India getting very deep, maybe zero tariff offers on particularly agricultural goods. And then I wanted to mention one Southeast Asian country. I won't mention the country itself, but they have a reciprocal tariff in the mid-40s. So that is from 0 to 3% up to mid-40s. This will affect up to 18% of their GDP. It's as a mid-sized nation, mid-sized economy. They've sent in their request to the Department of Commerce, USTR, and they've yet to receive even a response or acknowledgement of receipt. So imagine that, a country with up to 18% of their GDP affected by a trade agreement that they can't yet get a proper response on. We're some 3 weeks out from outcomes. So the bottom line is that the landing zone is becoming clearer. A sort of baseline of 10% for non-USMCA looks like it will be inevitable, but some deals will include baselines more around the 15 to 20% in some categories, particularly those with a higher labor-intensive component. So you want to break down what products we're talking about and how much labor goes into those. The deals will be dynamic, we know that. They'll continue to shift with prevailing policies, but that 10 to 20% range will stick almost inevitably. And that gives you some unfortunate predictability. But the complexity of the deals in some product areas actually creates the opportunity. And that's what we're going to talk about now, Andrew, as we get into the case study, is there are some steps in the value chain that if you tweak those, if you bring those into certain jurisdictions, particularly lower tariff jurisdictions, you can actually dramatically impact those headline tariffs. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about de minimis. We'll talk about bonded zones and free trade zones and the rules of origin engineering. We'll get through all of those once we get into the case. I'm sure that's where some of you will have a flurry of questions. And I think, as Andrew said, we'll do our best to answer those in the call itself. And then if we need to dive deeper individually.
Yeah.
So that's it. I'm very excited to be here with everyone. And Andrew, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. And you did a good job of throwing a mention to the new product that we have. All of us as former government folks, with the exception of you, Michael, but I would think you fall into the same category, are quite uncomfortable with any sales aspect of our job. But we do put that out there where we thought this consulting service could be kind of organized around some different steps, and you started to really get into that. Right now, we're gonna go through a case study, just a fairly simple one. This can get, as everyone can imagine, complex, but it really will highlight kind of where we're looking at and how we're helping individuals with whether it's doing a quick, rapid assessment of the exposure that they have, the situation that they're in, developing a more thorough playbook in order to provide further guidance for the company, all the way up into implementing either all of or aspects of that playbook. That is kind of what we are looking at as we collectively, as individuals and as the CT Tradeworthy gathering here, look to best service our clients in the best way that we can. So I'm gonna throw it back to you, Danny, to kick off the case study a bit. You're also I'm giving you all the credit. I don't want to be accused of plagiarizing, but I know you've come up with the scenario. We've all kind of looked at it of a U.S. owned. Basically, we're talking about a company. Let's call it Aurora. US owned jewelry company specializing in sterling silver. This all becomes important, as everyone knows on this call, when we're talking about identifying, the products and the commodities and knowing the supply chain. Most of the work is finished in Thailand, then shipped through Los Angeles into the US, and also up to Canada. So there's a lot of movements, not as many complicated supply chains, but I think based on those different points, we can start to really dive into really asking the question to each one of you as experts. If a company like that comes to you and says, what is my exposure here? What do I need to be doing? From the very kind of basic and honest, do I have a problem here? To all the way to the more specific of, what are my potential exposures? What are my potential problems and how can I fix them? And so I think it would help, Danny, maybe you start off kind of going through, we've talked about a number of different areas. I think we've identified 16 of them where there are certain categories of understanding and in this awareness that companies really need to start building around so that they can make effective decisions for the future. So anyway, with that as a kind of chapeau to the case study, I'll give it over to you to kind of go through a little bit more detail, and then we'll go around just to get everybody's response and understanding.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, look, you've outlined the case, and we've sort of circulated among the team to get their sense of what are the immediate actions that a company can do in this case. So just reminding, this is a jewelry company. We, for our own purposes, have called it Aurora Jewelry. And this is a company that normally pays around 5.5% on their silver jewelry imports into the US. But they're facing now a tariff anywhere between 25% up to 36%, depending on the particular product, mainly Thai origin, or so they think. This company would face under these reciprocal tariffs. And really, management knows that the numbers just won't work at that 36% level, but they haven't mapped the SKU level, the product level tariff exposure. And so they're unsure whether, options like a direct to Canada routing instead of through the US, rules of origin shifts, or maybe some FTZ arrangement could mitigate, again, that tariff exposure. So I'm going to go around the grounds, around the experts around the table. But really, one of the first questions that we would ask as specialists is, how do we start to map out that exposure? And what are the things that we need to look at? What's the data we need to look at? What are the information, the documents we need to look at to understand the exposure on a product by product basis? And then once we understand that, we have that base level understanding. I think it's Tim mentioned earlier around what's called the content or the origin of the materials inside the actual manufacturing in Thailand. Then we start to get a sense of what of these 15, 16 initiatives or strategies that we've identified. Some of those are, I think I mentioned, de minimis strategies. Are they applicable from certain jurisdictions? We know that Hong Kong and China are no longer eligible for de minimis sub $800 packages into the US. Are they bonded zones? Are there options for bringing a portion of that manufacturing process to a lower tariff jurisdiction? The best example being perhaps US or Canada, Canada or Mexico, where you bring a latest part of that transformation, you achieve what's called eligibility for origin under the USMCA, and then potentially import that final product at a zero tariff or close to zero under that agreement, which still to some extent stands in place. So these are the types of mechanisms. We can attack it from a range of different angles. The trick is to bring it all in one place, to get the right data, and then to have multidisciplinary, origin, USMCA or free trade agreement, et cetera, all of those aspects to look at that problem and then come up with the first best solution. So given that scenario, I did want to move around to our experts, and happy to have that on a volunteer basis or to name them individually, and to come up with, firstly, what are the questions you would be asking? What is the information you would be seeking to understand, to get from this company? And then what are the types of strategies that a company like this, producing multiple products, largely out of one jurisdiction, but with content and inputs from various jurisdictions, what are the kinds of interventions that could support or could, over time, reduce their tariff exposure? So perhaps we'll start with Tim, and then we'll move from there forward. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Danny. It's a very interesting question that you throw up there, and it does. I think I touched on a number of the points earlier on. Look, based on the information that's provided there, I couldn't confidently make a judgment on what the country of origin for the goods that we're talking about here would be, and as a result, what the applicable tariff rate would be coming into the US, assuming that there are different tariff rates applying to different countries, because we just don't have enough information there. And so that gets back to the point that I was making initially, that that importers who are going to be taking the responsibility for signing a declaration of origin have to build up that relationship with their suppliers so that they can answer those questions. Where are these goods coming from? Where are the raw materials coming from? Where are they being processed? What level of process is taking place in any particular country, so that we can then come up with a ruling. And at that point, you'd be looking to seek a binding ruling from customs on just what the country of origin should be. Now, fortunately, with customs, it is committed to providing binding rulings on tariff classification and country of origin. Its database, which is called the Customs Ruling Online Search System, has on record from the last approximately 30 years, about 217,000 binding rulings on questions such as this. I'm seeking to import this particular good. This is where it's manufactured. These are where the components come from. What is my tariff classification? Around 30,000 of those rulings cover questions of country of origin. However, they're all very specific to the case involved. So if anything about that case changes, if any of your suppliers change, then the ruling no longer is a binding ruling and doesn't apply to your imports. And so the process starts again. Customs has been pretty good over time. They're committed to providing responses once they have a full dossier of information on the production, to provide a response within 120 days. Not brilliant, but it's pretty good. And in fact, in most cases, they will come up with a ruling within often a week to 2 weeks, generally less than a month. So that really helps a lot. The problem for all of us is that, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to non-preferential rules of origin into the US, it's more a series of broad principles. The concept of where was this good substantially transformed? Where did the main process which gave the product its essential character take place? And that will be the basis on which the US makes a ruling. The ruling that the US makes will often be different to the ruling that will be made in another country. So if you go to your supplier in Thailand and say, I'm seeking to bring these goods in, can you give me any advice on supply chains and on the country of origin? If the Thai supplier has experience of dealing into the EU, the ruling they would have got from the EU would be entirely different to the ruling they get from the US. So you do need to go through the customs process in order to get that degree of certainty, in order for you to be able to make that claim. One of I went through the database looking for something similar. And when it came on the customs database, and there was one ruling from a product about 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, which was silver jewelry, which was being exported from China to, it was principally, it seemed, manufactured in Hong Kong. And the ruling that the customs gave, well, while it appears to have been made in Hong Kong, whether it has been substantially manufactured in Hong Kong depends on the nature of the processing that took place there. If they've just assembled a number of components that have come from a number of other countries, that may not be sufficient for it to claim Hong Kong origin and therefore get Hong Kong tariffs instead of Chinese tariffs. And so that degree of uncertainty, if I'm a businessman, is the sort of thing that fills me with dread. Nevertheless, we have the pathway and we have the methods to help assist you in getting through and direct you towards a pathway so that you can get the best information to get around the sorts of problems that present themselves when you're shifting from the way you've done trade in the past to the way that you will need to do trade going forward. I think I'll probably leave it there for this point, but yeah, happy to follow up on any of those issues.
We have establishing the certainty of origin through a ruling process. Okay, Brad, over to you from the sort of customs compliance perspective as well.
Yeah, certainly. Just a couple of quick points, and Tim just did a wonderful job again of talking to substantial transformation. My attention is drawn to that country of origin shift. Some basic information I would want to gather up front are the applicable harmonized tariff codes for the product in question. And you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, certainly. And as you mentioned, Danny, SKU by SKU. Certain products, products even within a product line can have variances, differences. But I would certainly want to see product brochures. I would want to see bills of materials along with country of origin, supporting declarations for those components. A diagram, a narrative of the manufacturing process would certainly be helpful. Any information that the company may have in its possession regarding previous inquiries or research that they would have done. And I would ask, is there, does the product after processing have a different name, character, use, essential character? Is the transformation complex? Is there value added? in the USMCA context and most free trade agreements, it's usually driven based upon a tariff swing, a tariff shift. So for this particular product, when I was looking at it, a shift for the raw material, raw component has to occur from another heading within the harmonized tariff for the good to qualify. So we would have to step back in each step of the process to determine where that transformation, where that tariff shift occurs, and then make a decision. Yeah, we think it shifts. And then you could make decisions. Do I move my manufacturing or that part of the processing, that step to that particular country? And, I think I see a question here, and I was going to make that point. Yet from a customs perspective, by seeking a binding ruling, I think it's always advisable to have that insurance policy, if you would. I know, Michael, I've heard you talk about customs is sending out a lot of customs form 28s and 29s nowadays to validate. That goes back to the trade enforcement posture. So country of origin, and then foreign trade zones. I don't know that we'll have time to talk about it, but there could be, and a lot of companies have taken advantage of independent, either customs bonded warehouses or foreign trade zones. The product doesn't enter the jurisdiction of the U.S. Duties aren't paid until it's withdrawn. Helps with cash flow, flexibility, especially if they were to bring it in and then move it to send the product going to Canada out of the warehouse. So it helps from that cash flow. Duties as the sale, actually pay the duties as the sale occurs. Just some quick thoughts from where my standpoint, Dan.
I could jump in, Danny. I know I'm going off script for a second, but to that very point that Brad was bringing up at the end, the FTZ versus bonded warehouse, if that's an option, I wouldn't make that determination based on this case study alone. But what I would say to the group is to be very careful that decision is right for your business model, number one, and number two, that you're making the right decision based on a highly volatile tariff situation. So you're not locking yourself in to any particular tariff structure that might change for the better as we look to see some of the kind of the pressure release. So I'm violating my own rule of jumping in. You're moderating this part, but I just wanted to make that point. And while I have the floor, I'll just make one other point. I think underscoring all of this is, the whole reason why we're doing this is to give people an understanding that there are legitimate ways to maximize your business position, even in this uncertain time. And what we want to make sure that we do is we know the rules, we abide by the rules, and we use those rules to best inform the judgment after we have, a set of awareness. I think we can all agree, and I'm sure everyone on the call agrees, that trying to do something where you're skirting a tariff or trying to obfuscate something is not something you want to do. It's short term at best. It's illegal at worst. And so I think that's where the challenge is. And I think that's where Tim and Brad have really gotten into establishing, let's get our arms around what our product is, where it's coming from, what we're doing, and the strategies that we can employ. So anyway, I'll stop talking now. Turn it back to you, Danny.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I know we're coming up to the hour. We're going to go a little over, and then we're going to explain how this all comes together with the experts around the table in a kind of joint offering. But I wanted to throw firstly to Gordon, if you want to jump in. And, I think we've talked about as a group that there are many seeming solutions popping up here and there around origin claiming where there's no justification, those kind of non-compliant, frankly, illegal practices. That is not what we're talking about here, of course, as well. So Gordon, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, Danny. That's not our business. Actually, we're not here for that. I mean, but looking directly at the question, the first thing that, the case study, the first thing that I would be looking at to say is the direct into Canada option viable, and that would require the company really to look at the logistics costs, the processing costs, setting up offices, and comparing that with transiting through the US option, which was set down in the case study. So I would expect and I'd advise a company to look at that first and foremost, because that may take care of the whole Canadian import processing component. I guess where I would be looking at, I'm not a rules of origin expert, but what I would look at very deeply is the company profile, because understanding the company, its profile, where it's manufacturing, who it's working with, what components they're using, where they're coming from, is all the information that you need in order to make an informed decision and set out what all the different options are. And you can only do that by doing maybe first a quick look at the company, but then a much more deeper dive to basically understand how the company works and how it operates and all those different components. And that will require a degree of, obviously, maybe questionnaires, calls, meeting in person. But the key point I wanted to make on this is the importance to ensure that when the options are being set out, you've not only gathered that information, but you've got the evidence there as well. And Brad touched on this with mentioning, customs declarations and information before, because certainly that shows that the due diligence has been done by the company and also by companies like that like us that are advising them accordingly. So they're my main views, basically, Danny. In the interest of time, I'll keep it short.
Danny, can I add?
Yeah, Michael. Yeah, go ahead.
So Gordon, you're absolutely right, right? But I think we also need to think about there may not be one option, right? Because the business units may be doing different things. So
Yeah.
FTZ may work for one, free trade agreements may work for another one. So I think we need to, when you look at things like this, right, it's just not what's the one solution. There could be probably multiple solutions. And then I just want to add and say, once you make that and you start executing on those, right, you're changing your history of how you do things. And I think, Gordon, you mentioned that, right? Documents, documents, documents. And I think companies that do this really need to then make that effort to make sure they have a document trail on their from their manufacturing process all the way through, because I think that's going to be questioned. And Brad, you brought that up, right? There's a lot of what we're going to call verifications going on, and companies are going to have to not just submit a form, but expect verifications come back. So I'll just add there for you.
Well, thank you for those interventions. I think what's clear is that there are solutions to even the most brutal seeming tariffs. It's going to depend on the company's desire for change. It's going to depend on the information that is, obviously going through on a product by product level. So perhaps with that, I'll hand it back to Andrew, and I think we're going to move towards a kind of a bit of a wrap up and then a discussion about the sort of trade path solution of bringing it all together. But over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, and I would just start my conclusion with the specific point that Michael brought up and Gordon hit on as well, the documentation point. I mean, our world centers around, trust but verify when we look at all the customs partnerships that we do. And that transcends both from the business to government relationship and the business to business relationship that is important in the supply chain. And I think that where we have seen in the past things really fall down or go south, or is when that documentation isn't, not to say that it's wrong or done intentionally to obfuscate something, but where it's just not complete. And there will be a point where that is going to be asked for. And this goes back to a point that I know Brad made in his initial statement, which is there are other priorities that the governments around the world are going to be looking at, whether it's the security position of the US, whether it's some of the environmental and forced labor requirements that we're seeing in other parts of the world. There is any movement in changing your history is really going to dramatically affect the way the government looks at you as a trader. And I think, and it's okay. I mean, I think we're all being very stern in this discussion. That's not a problem. And I think most companies are going to be getting to that point. But it is critical to do that with intention and with documentation. That's something that I think is helpful. To that point, I don't know if this is a good transition or I just think it is. In terms of documentation, Danny, you mentioned and I mentioned it as well. This offering we're calling TradePath, and I think that was marketed on the flyer. Again, we want to make sure as a company that we are offering the best advice we can. Now, for anyone seeking a quick conversation to see if any of this makes sense, we're available. just give us a shout. We'll set up a time. Don't worry about that. We want to make sure at the end of the day that any service that we have is applicable and will be a viable solution for you. What I can tell you that it is something we've been hitting at and represent here today is a gathering of different disciplines on one team that can respond very quickly. The gentlemen here represented are the subject matter experts. But we have a laundry list of others, and I say that not just to say how many friends we have, but also to say that, we are one thing that we do collectively between you, Danny, at Tradeworthy and me at CT is put together the right team for the right case. So it will entirely depend on the unique situation that the company is in, but we're here to help. And the way that we do it, and I'll turn it back to you, Danny, to talk about it a little bit, is again mentioning that kind of three different types of products. One is the rapid needs assessment. I mean, we're all in a position right now where time is of the essence. We are worried. And I would imagine most people on this call have bosses that are asking them for answers right now. And I think one of the things in coming in and doing a rapid needs assessment satisfies at least that very human need of telling their boss that we've got an answer, we've engaged with experts, here's what we're looking at in terms of our exposure. And then we can evolve into, potential solutions to that exposure that include short, medium, and long-term plans in what we're calling our playbook. That playbook then gets translated into a number of different solution sets. Danny, I think you mentioned there's 16 different potential areas in which we can help. And then should the company need further implementation help through training and advisory services, I think we're there as well. That's my best version of a salesman as we do this. But I think for us, and I'll stop my piece and turn it back over to you, Danny. But I think for us, we do have a lot of subject matter expertise. We're getting individually, everybody on this call is getting questions from people we know in the business, and I think this is the beginning of putting that out there more officially in a way that can really help and serve a larger community. So I hope it does. I hope it does that. So Danny, I just turn to you for any last minute thoughts you have.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So, this concept, this TradePath concept, and the service offering, which is evolving and will evolve, really responds to just the uncertainty in the market that we're seeing, that volatility. And this is the truth: is that each of us are getting calls supporting our own, individual bevy of clients and companies. But because the nature of the problem is so systemic, you can't just answer an issue of origin in itself. You need to look at it from a multidisciplinary approach. And frankly, like never before, I've certainly never come across this multidisciplinary complexity before. And so bringing it all together is really the secret sauce. So when we are presented with a particular supply chain, and the way we approach it with the rapid needs assessment is we look at 10 SKUs or 10 products, whether they're representative or even the 10 products that the company brings into the States or sends out of the States or trades. And we analyze those from every one of the data points that the team mentioned and come up with a strategy, and applying those 16 different points of, we call it sort of duty mitigation strategies. And then you take that rapid needs assessment, we're targeting within 30 days, and you say, okay, this is feasible, that's not feasible, that is feasible if we change it this way. And then we get into the playbook, and the playbook is that step-by-step approach to how to implement that. We've actually done these playbooks in different scenarios. We've worked with companies, but they're typically then on market entry. How do we get our products from one market that we already trade in into another market? The game's changed, and now it's looking at how we continue business as usual when the rules of the game are changing. And so that's where we bring that interdisciplinary team together through the rapid needs assessment, the playbook, and then obviously the implementation. So that's about as salesy as I get as well. But I think the point about this, the reason we wanted to have this webinar organized quite rapidly, and this concept of TradePath sort of put together quite rapidly, is we're responding to a really volatile mix of circumstances that goes to the heart of many of you on the call, many of your companies, and your business as usual. So it's not usual anymore. And so we needed to bring together these multidisciplinary teams to look at supply chains, to look at product by product, and give you the best advice that you can get. So that's the concept. We really are open to discussions. We want to hear your challenges as they apply to your products, for your companies and your trade flows. And we hope this will be of some value to the market, and we'll evolve it as needs be. And we know there are going to be announcements coming up on a minute by minute basis, and we'll have to adapt to that, including the rulings and the regulations put out by CBP, almost now on a daily, certainly multiple weekly basis. We're on top of that. We're monitoring it all, and that has an effect on your business as usual. So again, reach out to us and we can apply these disciplines, these tools to your products and trade flows.
Yeah. Now, thanks, Danny. And just to end on that point, yeah, reach out. Just if you have any questions, we will be continuing to put new material out. To Matthew and Sherry, who have dutifully put questions in, I don't want to give your answers short shrift. So I will, on behalf of this group, get together and we'll get you an email, potentially a conversation, but just something that we can get to you. You see that we put up here a QR code you can connect with us in any way. We'll just happy to have a conversation. I do want to take time to thank the experts. Thanks everybody for jumping on, all of you in very different time zones, and appreciate all your insight, and just being your colleague. And last but not least, someone who has remained off screen, but our Director of Global Development, Aaron Sofianik, who along with Danny and myself, just because I'm around, but really it's been Danny and Aaron putting this thing together as quickly as you have, to respond to the needs of the community, is greatly appreciated. And I thought you guys did a great job. So thanks all for joining. I'm looking forward to talking more. Again, we'll be reaching out with some answers to those that we weren't able to answer at this point. So thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the day or evening, depending on where you are. Thanks all. Take care.